Seo Jun leaned back against the leather of the idling sedan, checking his watch as the rain hammered against the reinforced glass. He was here to end a turf war, not to play savior. He never expected his car door to fly open. He definitely never expected the frantic woman who lunged into the backseat, pulling a small, shivering girl into the shadows with her. The heavy door thudded shut, sealing out the roar of the storm and replacing it with the sudden, sharp scent of wet asphalt and sheer terror. Seo Jun froze, one hand resting on the gold head of his cane, the other inches from the holster at his hip. Outside, his enforcer, the man with a neck tattoo, reached for the door handle, his face a mask of lethal confusion. In 15 years of climbing the ranks of the Dragon Syndicate, Seo Jun had never had his perimeter breached by anything less than a professional hit squad. But today, the vacuum of his private world had been shattered by something he hadn't seen in years: raw, civilian desperation. The interior of the car was vast, a moving fortress of black silk and cold steel, far too intimidating for the woman now huddled on the floorboards. The soft blue glow of the dashboard lights caught the silver of her tears and the way she shielded the child with her own body. A muffled shout came from the alley, a man's voice, jagged and demanding. And then Seo Jun looked at her. She wasn't a professional. She was a bird flying into a lion's den to escape a wildfire. Her skin, deep and rich against the pale cream of her daughter's coat, glistened with raindrops. She looked up, her gaze meeting his, and for the first time in a decade, the dragon's breath hitched. She didn't look at him like a boss or a monster. She looked at him like he was her last heartbeat of hope. Before we begin, like this video, hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. The rain didn't just fall, it punished. It turned the narrow alleyway into a throat of slick brick and shadows, choking the breath out of Mirabelle Stephen as she ran. Her lungs burned with a cold, damp air, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't even slow down. In her arms, 3-year-old Priscilla was a weight of pure, trembling terror, her small face buried deep into Mirabelle's neck. Behind them, the rhythmic splash of heavy boots hit the puddles, a sound more terrifying than the thunder rolling overhead. "Mirabelle, get back here." Charles's voice drifted through the downpour, jagged and possessed by a calm, terrifying entitlement. "You're making this so much harder for yourself." She rounded a corner, her breath hitching. The alley spilled out onto a side street, but it was a dead end of locked iron gates and brick. The only thing breaking the gloom was the low, predatory hum of a black luxury sedan idling near the curb. Its headlights cut through the sheets of rain like the eyes of a deep-sea creature. It looked like a fortress, silent, impenetrable, and dangerous. Desperation is a powerful fuel. To Mirabelle, the car wasn't a stranger's vehicle. It was a life raft in a sea of monsters. She didn't think. She didn't calculate the odds of who might be behind those tinted windows. As Charles's shadow lengthened against the brick wall behind her, she lunged for the rear handle. To her shock, the heavy door clicked open. She dove inside, her wet boots sliding on the plush floorboards as she pulled Priscilla into the darkness with her. The door thudded shut with a heavy, pressurized seal that instantly swallowed the sound of the storm. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of her own ragged sobbing and the scent of expensive leather and sandalwood. Then, the temperature in the car seemed to drop. "You have exactly 3 seconds to explain why you are in my car," a voice drawled from the shadows of the far seat. It was a cold, melodic sound, smooth as silk but sharp as a razor. Mirabelle froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked up, pushing her soaked hair from her face. Seated just inches away was a man who looked like he had been carved from obsidian. His dark eyes were fixed on her with a detached, lethal curiosity. Outside, a fist slammed against the reinforced glass. Charles's distorted face appeared at the window, his eyes wide with frantic rage as he tried to peer through the tint. "Open the door," Charles screamed, his voice muffled by the glass. "That's my wife, open this damn door." The man in the suit didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the window. His gaze remained locked on Mirabelle, tracing the bruise blooming on her cheek and the way she tightened her grip on the child. "Is that the monster?" the man asked quietly. Mirabelle could only nod, a single sob escaping her throat. The man leaned forward, the light from the dashboard illuminating the cold, predatory grace of his features. "Good," he murmured, a ghost of a dark smile touching his lips. "I've always found monsters to be quite boring." The glass between the interior of the car and the outside world was more than just a physical barrier. It was the line between a sanctuary and a slaughterhouse. Charles continued to pound his fist against the window, his face contorted into a mask of frantic, ugly possessiveness. He looked pathetic from this side, a small man shouting at a mountain. Seo-jun didn't move. He watched Charles with the clinical boredom of a scientist observing an insect. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion of his finger, he pressed the button on the armrest. The window began to slide down, the hum of the motor sounding like a guillotine blade being raised. The roar of the rain flooded back into the cabin, along with the smell of Charles's cheap cologne and his frantic, ragged breath. Charles didn't wait for the glass to clear the frame before he reached inside, his fingers hooked like talons. "Get out of the car, Mirabelle," Charles hissed, his eyes darting to the man in the shadows only for a second before dismissing him as a mere driver. "You think you can hide behind some suit? You're mine, do you hear me? Get out now before you what?" Seo-jun's voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying gravity that caused the air to go still. He leaned into the light, allowing the street lamp to catch the sharp, predatory lines of his face. The casual arrogance on Charles's face withered. He finally saw the tailored perfection of the suit, the heavy gold ring on Seo-jun's hand, and the utter lack of fear in the eyes of the man looking back at him. In the front seat, the man with the neck tattoo shifted, his hand moving toward the center console with a fluid, practiced motion. He looked at Seo-jun, waiting for a single nod to end the nuisance. "This is a private matter," Charles stammered, his bravado leaking away like water through a sieve. He tried to straighten his shoulders, but his hand had already retreated from the window frame. "She's my property. She belongs to me." Seo-jun tilted his head. The movement was slow, almost graceful. "Property," he repeated, the word tasting like poison. He looked at Mirabelle, who was trembling so hard the leather seats creaked, then back at the man in the rain. "A man who calls a woman property is a man who owns nothing of value, not even his own life." Seo-jun signaled his enforcer. The car door didn't just open, it swung wide with the force of a threat. Seo-jun stepped out into the rain, not bothering with an umbrella. He stood a full head taller than Charles, a dark titan in the middle of the storm. "She is no longer yours to touch," Seo-jun said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper that cut through the thunder. "She belongs to the dragon now, and the dragon does not like to share." He leaned in closer, his shadow swallowing Charles whole. "Run, while I am still feeling merciful enough to let you keep your legs." The sedan glided through the iron gates of a sprawling estate on the city's edge, a place where the city's noise died, and was replaced by the silent, oppressive weight of power. As the car slowed to a halt under a massive stone portico, Mirabelle clutched Priscilla tighter. The warmth of the car had begun to dry the child's hair, but the sight of the men waiting for them made Mirabelle's own blood run cold. The doors were opened by men who looked like extensions of the architecture, tall, unyielding, and clad in monochromatic suits that absorbed the dim light. They didn't speak. They didn't even blink. Their eyes swept over the interior of the car, lingering for a fraction of a second on the terrified woman and the toddler before returning to Seo-jun. "The perimeter is secure, boss," the man with the neck tattoo muttered, stepping out of the front seat. He held a black umbrella over Seo-jun as the leader stepped out onto the gravel. Seo-jun turned back toward the open door, his silhouette framed by the sterile, blue-toned lights of the courtyard. "Bring them inside," he commanded. It wasn't a request, but there was a strange, jagged edge of care in the way he waited for them to move. Mirabelle stepped out into the cold fortress. The foyer of the headquarters was a cathedral of marble and glass, polished to a mirror shine. It was a masculine world of sharp angles and high-tech security hubs. The air was filtered and scentless, stripped of the messy, human smells of the rain and the street. Everywhere she looked, there were enforcers, men with tactical earpieces and scarred knuckles, moving with the silent efficiency of predators. The contrast was jarring. Priscilla, in her small, pale pink coat and muddy sneakers, looked like a wildflower dropped into a field of obsidian. Her small hand gripped Mirabelle's thumb as she stared up at a towering guard who stood near the elevator. The guard, a man whose face looked as though it had been carved from granite, looked down. For a fleeting second, his stern expression faltered, his eyes widening at the sight of something so fragile in a place built for war. "This is the North Wing," Seo-jun said, his footsteps echoing like gunshots against the marble. "The men here are trained to keep things out. Tonight, they will learn how to keep something in." He stopped at the base of a grand staircase and looked at Priscilla. The toddler let out a small, tired whimper, the sound echoing through the hollow, silent hall. In this temple of violence, the sound of a child's breath was the loudest thing in the room. Seo-jun's gaze softened, just barely, as he looked at the two worlds colliding in his lobby. "Show them to the residential suite," he told the man with the tattoo. "And find something soft for the child to sleep on. We don't have many toys in a fortress." The residential suite was a masterpiece of cold luxury, all charcoal linens and floor-to-ceiling glass. But to Mirabelle, it felt like a cage made of diamonds. She spent the first few hours in a state of suspended animation, her ears straining for the sound of Charles's heavy tread, only to be met by the low hum of the estate's industrial climate control. When a soft knock sounded at the door, Mirabelle flinched, pulling the duvet tighter around a sleeping Priscilla. It wasn't Charles. It was Seo-jun. He had shed his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension and a glimpse of ink that vanished into his cuffs. He didn't enter. He stood in the doorway, a silent sentinel. "There are rules in this house," he began, his voice dropping into that melodic, dangerous register. "They are different from the ones you fled." Mirabelle stood, her legs shaking. "I don't even know what this place is. I saw the men, the guns. I know you're not a businessman, not a civilian one." Seo-jun stepped into the room, his presence shrinking the vast space. "I run a syndicate. My business is the management of debt, loyalty, and silence. In my world, a broken promise is a death sentence. To the police, I am a ghost. To my enemies, I am the dragon. But to you," he paused, his eyes scanning her face with a strange, analytical intensity, "I am the wall between you and the man who wants to break you." He walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling city lights. "Rule 1, you do not leave this estate without my shadow, the man you saw in the car. Rule 2, you do not communicate with the world you left behind. Charles is looking for a victim. I will not let him find a trail." Mirabelle swallowed hard, the weight of his protection feeling heavier than she expected. "And what do you want in return? No one gives this much for nothing." Seo-jun turned back to her. The blue moonlight caught the edge of a scar near his temple. "Loyalty," he said simply. "Absolute and unwavering. In this fortress, my word is the only law. If I tell you to run, you run. If I tell you to hide, you disappear. I do not demand your love, Mirabelle. I demand your trust. In my world, trust is more expensive than gold and twice as rare." He looked toward the bed where Priscilla stirred in her sleep. "Your daughter is safe here because I have willed it. My men will die before they let a hand touch her. But if you betray the location of this house, or if you lie to me, the protection ends." He moved toward the door, leaving her in the silence of the high-rise. "Sleep now. Tomorrow, you begin to learn that the safest place in the world is standing directly behind a monster." The silence in the estate was a heavy, artificial thing, but it was nothing compared to the silence within Priscilla. Since the night Charles had shattered the glass of their bedroom door, the 3-year-old had retreated into a wordless void. She watched the world with wide, hollow eyes, her voice lost somewhere in the trauma of the flight. Mirabelle sat in the sun-drenched breakfast nook of the residential wing, trying to coax Priscilla to eat. The girl sat motionless, her small fingers tracing the pattern on a porcelain plate. Across the room, Seo-jun stood by a marble counter, nursing a black coffee and reading a digital report. He looked out of place in the morning light, a creature of midnight forced into the dawn. He had been a silent, brooding presence for 3 days, maintaining a distance that felt more like a barrier than a choice. She used to love stories, Mirabelle whispered, more to herself than to him. Now she won't even whisper mommy. Seo-jun didn't look up from his screen, but his shoulders tightened. He set his cup down with a soft clink and walked toward the table. His presence usually made the air feel thin, but today he seemed to move with a suppressed gentleness. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over the table. Priscilla looked up. Most people flinched under Seo-jun's gaze, but the child simply stared, her head tilted. She reached out a small, trembling hand and touched the gold dragon-head handle of the cane Seo-jun had leaned against the chair. "Careful, little bird," Seo-jun murmured, his voice losing its jagged edge. Priscilla's fingers traced the intricate scales of the gold dragon. Then, in a voice as soft as a falling leaf, she spoke. "Dragon," she whispered. Mirabelle gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears blurred her vision instantly. It was the first sound Priscilla had made in 4 months. Seo-jun froze. The man who negotiated with cutthroats and commanded an army of shadows looked suddenly, profoundly stunned. He slowly sank into the chair opposite the toddler, bringing his face level with hers. The lethal coldness in his eyes didn't just crack, it dissolved. "Yes," he said, his voice low and strangely thick. "A dragon. Do you know what dragons do, Priscilla?" The girl shook her head slowly, her eyes locked on his. "They guard the things that are precious," Seo-jun said, reaching out a finger to gently tuck a stray curl behind her ear. "They burn anything that tries to take them away." Priscilla reached out and patted his hand, a hand that had likely dealt more pain than she could imagine, and gave a tiny, flickering smile. In that moment, the power dynamic of the fortress shifted. Seo-jun wasn't just a protector anymore. He was a captive to the innocence he had forgotten existed. He looked at Mirabelle, and for the first time, she didn't see a boss or a monster. She saw a man who had finally found something worth the fire. Charles Austin was unraveling. The silence following the disappearance of Mirabelle and Priscilla wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of his lungs and replaced it with a toxic, humiliated rage. He had spent weeks scouring the city, but the black sedan had vanished as if it were a ghost ship. He knew he was outmatched by whoever had taken his property, yet his obsession outweighed his survival instinct. He found himself in a low-rent bar on the outskirts of the harbor, a place where the air smelled of stale beer and desperation. Across from him sat 2 men whose faces were maps of violence, local mercenaries who specialized in the kind of dirty work that didn't require questions. "The car is a customized armored sedan," Charles said, his voice trembling as he slid a grainy photo across the scarred wooden table. "I need to know where it went. I don't care who owns it." The taller of the 2 men, a man with a jagged scar across his bridge of his nose, looked at the photo and let out a low whistle. "That's dragon territory, pal. You're asking us to kick a hornet's nest." "I have money," Charles hissed, pulling a thick envelope from his coat. "Find them, just find them." Greed eventually smothered the mercenaries' caution. Within 48 hours, they had tracked the vehicle's signature to a supply run in the warehouse district. But they didn't understand the world they were trying to infiltrate. They expected a driver. They didn't expect the shadow. The skirmish broke out behind a shipping container. As the mercenaries attempted to plant a tracker on one of Seo-jun's transport SUVs, the tactical earpiece man, the Caucasian enforcer Mirabelle had seen at the estate, stepped out from the fog. He didn't pull a gun immediately. He didn't have to. The street-level violence was swift and surgical. The mercenaries were brutal, but the dragon's men were a machine. There were no cinematic monologues, only the dull thud of fist against bone and the metallic click of a tactical baton expanding. The air was punctuated by the sound of glass shattering and a single, suppressed gunshot that echoed like a snapped twig. By the time the dust settled, Charles's hired help was sprawling in the oily puddles of the alleyway. The enforcer adjusted his earpiece, his breathing barely elevated. He looked down at a burner phone he had recovered from one of the men. On the screen was a flurry of frantic texts from Charles. "The rat is scratching at the walls, boss," the enforcer said into his mic, his voice calm. Back at the estate, Seo Jun watched the surveillance feed of the aftermath. His jaw tightened. Charles hadn't just crossed a line, he had invited a war into a house that was finally starting to feel like a home. The cabin fever was a slow-acting poison, and eventually, the four walls of the luxury suite began to close in on Mirabelle. She had begged for a moment of normalcy, a simple trip to the grocery store to buy the specific brand of apple juice Priscilla loved. Seo Jun had resisted, his eyes flashing with a cold, protective fire, but eventually he had relented with a single, sharp nod. The local market was a bright, bustling contrast to the sterile silence of the estate. Mirabelle pushed the cart down the aisle, the wheels squeaking rhythmically against the linoleum. For a few minutes, she allowed herself to forget. She reached for a carton of milk, her fingers brushing the cold plastic, and felt like a normal woman again. But the illusion shattered the moment she turned the corner toward the bakery. A man in a dark hoodie stood by the artisan breads, his back to her, seemingly engrossed in a label. But as Mirabelle moved, he moved. When she stopped to check her list, a different man in a gray windbreaker stopped 20 paces behind her, his hand subtly adjusting something near his ear. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't alone, she was the center of a moving perimeter. In the reflected glass of the freezer section, she finally saw him. It was the Caucasian enforcer, the one with the tactical earpiece. He wasn't hiding. He stood by the exit, his posture relaxed but his eyes scanning the crowd with the predatory focus of a hawk. He didn't look like a shopper, he looked like a soldier waiting for a signal. Every time a stranger got within 5 feet of Mirabelle, his hand moved toward his jacket, and the other shoppers in the aisle, men she now realized were disguised guards, subtly shifted to block the path. Mirabelle felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the frozen food. This wasn't just a grocery trip. It was a high-stakes extraction mission disguised as a chore. As she reached the checkout, a man stumbled slightly, his shoulder brushing against hers. Before Mirabelle could even gasp, the man in the hoodie was there, his hand clamping onto the stranger's wrist with a grip that looked bone-deep. No words were exchanged, but the stranger's face went pale as he was stepped around and ushered away by a second unseen guard. Mirabelle looked toward the exit, catching the eye of the enforcer with the earpiece. He gave her a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent reminder of the rules Seo Jun had laid out. Her freedom was now a curated experience, a gift granted only under the shadow of the dragon's wings. She realized then that Charles could never find her, not because she was hidden, but because she was the most heavily guarded person in the city. Charles was no longer a man. He was a hollowed-out vessel of resentment. And that made him the perfect tool for a more sophisticated class of evil. He sat in a dimly lit warehouse that smelled of salt and diesel, staring across a scarred mahogany desk at a man whose reputation was built on the wreckage Seo Jun had left behind. Park Ji-sung, the leader of the Iron Tiger Syndicate and Seo Jun's bitterest rival, leaned into the light. Unlike Seo Jun's cold, sharp elegance, Ji-sung was a man of heavy proportions and a smile that never reached his eyes. He didn't care about Charles's domestic grievances, but he cared deeply about the fact that the dragon had developed a weakness. "You're telling me he's keeping a civilian woman and a child at his private estate?" Ji-sung asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He turned a heavy gold lighter over in his hands. Seo Jun doesn't have a heart. He has a stone in his chest. Why would he risk his reputation for a stray? I don't care why, Charles snapped, his voice cracking with a desperation that bordered on madness. He took them. He insulted me. I want them back, and I want him to watch while I take them. Di-sung chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. You want to reclaim your property, and I want to reclaim the docks that the dragon stole from me last winter. It seems we have a common goal. He signaled to one of his lieutenants, who placed a detailed architectural blueprint on the desk. It was the safe house, the cold fortress that Mirabelle thought was impenetrable. Charles leaned in, his eyes wide and feverish as he traced the lines of the residential wing. He didn't see the tactical traps or the security layers. He only saw the room where his wife and daughter were sleeping. My men will handle the heavy lifting, Di-sung said, his tone turning clinical. We'll initiate a hit on the eastern perimeter to draw his main enforcers away. In the chaos, you'll have a 5-minute window to enter through the service tunnel. My team will extract the assets. You get your family, and I get the satisfaction of watching Seo Jun's empire crumble when he realizes he couldn't even protect a toddler. Charles nodded frantically, the deal sealed in the shadows. He didn't realize he was just a piece of bait in a much larger trap. To Di-sung, Charles was a disposable pawn. To Charles, this was a rescue mission. But to the dragon, this was the moment the world would learn that mercy had its limits. The unholy alliance was formed, and the fuse was lit on a war that would soon bring the scent of smoke to Mirabelle's doorstep. The sirens didn't scream. The house simply exhaled a low, pulsing red light. Mirabelle was jolted from sleep as the heavy mahogany door to her suite burst open. It wasn't Charles. It was the enforcer with the neck tattoo, his tactical vest pulled tight and an assault rifle held with practiced ease. Get in the closet. Now, he barked, his voice stripped of all civility. Mirabelle scooped Priscilla into her arms, the toddler's breath hitching in a silent sob. Outside the reinforced windows, the night was being torn apart. The dull asterisk thud-thud of suppressed gunfire echoed from the eastern gardens, and the estate's peaceful silence was replaced by the frantic crackle of radios. The worlds had finally collided. The sterile, cool-toned world of Seo Jun's security was being breached by the chaotic, desperate violence of Charles and the Iron Tigers. Mirabelle huddled in the reinforced walk-in closet, her back against the cold steel of a safe. She could hear the heavy boots of men moving through the hallway, the rhythmic, steady pace of Seo Jun's guards meeting the frantic, heavy stomps of intruders. Then, a voice that made her blood turn to ice drifted through the door. Mirabelle, I know you're in here. Charles's voice was high-pitched, vibrating with a terrifying, manic glee. Did you think this Chinaman could keep me away? I'm coming to take you home. A heavy crash shook the bedroom. Metal groaned against metal. Mirabelle squeezed her eyes shut, pressing Priscilla's head against her chest. She heard the sound of a struggle, the grunts of men, the wet sound of a fist connecting with flesh, and then a sudden, absolute silence. The closet door creaked open. Mirabelle prepared to scream, but the light that spilled in didn't reveal Charles. Seo Jun stood in the doorway. He was drenched in rain and blood, none of it his own. His shirt was torn, and the gold head of his cane was smeared with crimson. Behind him, the room was a wreckage of broken glass and fallen men. Charles was nowhere to be seen, likely dragged into the shadows by the shadows himself. Seo Jun didn't say a word. He reached out a hand, his fingers steady despite the carnage surrounding them. Priscilla looked at him, then slowly reached out her small hand to catch his thumb. The dragon, the child whispered into the quiet room. Seo Jun's expression didn't soften into a smile, but the lethal tension in his jaw relaxed. He looked at Mirabelle, his dark eyes promising a finality she had never known. It's over, he said, his voice a low vibration that grounded her. The monster is gone, and he is never coming back. The morning after the siege arrived with a clarity that felt almost surreal. The storm had washed the city clean, leaving the estate's gardens glistening under a pale, golden sun. There were no sirens, no shouting, and no more shadows lurking in the corners of Mirabelle's mind. The monster in the civilian suit was gone, neutralized not by the law, but by a power that operated far beyond it. Mirabelle stood on the stone terrace, watching Priscilla run through the grass. The toddler was chasing a butterfly, her laughter ringing out, a bright, silver sound that seemed to heal the very air of the fortress. For the first time in years, Mirabelle didn't check the perimeter. She didn't look for the nearest exit. She simply breathed. A slow, rhythmic tap announced his arrival. Seo-jun stepped onto the terrace, dressed in a fresh charcoal suit, looking every bit the pristine architect of this world. The violence of the previous night had been scrubbed away, leaving only the quiet gravity of a man who had kept his word. "The Iron Tigers have withdrawn their claim," Seo-jun said, standing beside her. He didn't look at her. He watched Priscilla with a contemplative gaze. "And Charles has been relocated to a place where he can never hurt anyone again. He is a ghost now." Mirabelle looked at his profile, the sharp jaw, the scar near his temple, the hands that knew exactly how to destroy and how to protect. "You killed him," she said softly. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't an accusation either. "I ended the threat," Seo-jun corrected, finally turning to meet her eyes. "There is a difference." In that moment, the broken compass of Mirabelle's trust finally found its north. She had spent her life terrified of dangerous men, only to realize that the most dangerous man in the city was the only one who had ever truly kept her safe. He was a dragon, yes, lethal, cold, and bound by a code of blood, but he had built a nest for her and her child where no storm could reach them. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice steady. Seo-jun reached out, his hand hovering near hers before he let it rest on the terrace railing. "Now, you live, you teach her to speak again, you walk in the sun, and if the world ever tries to be cruel to you again, you remember who is standing behind you." Mirabelle reached out and placed her hand over his. His skin was cool, but his grip was unyielding. As Priscilla let out another peal of laughter, Mirabelle realized that while the world would always be a dangerous place, she was finally home. She wasn't just a victim who had survived. She was a woman who had found sanctuary in the heart of the storm. Thanks for watching, and remember to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss interesting stories like this. See you in the next story.